I wanted to ask, and in all of these cases, we've seen so many big cases this year that we've covered on this show and other podcasts have covered. And there's so much because of all of the, basically the light shined on all of these cases by so many different opinions. Who is Bryan Kohberger? We know that he was a doctoral student at Washington University. We know he was from Pennsylvania, but we know at one time he was a heroin addict. He's probably a loner. I mean, all of these theories about him being an incel and these other things. And what we would say, being in law enforcement, we say, no way does someone go out on the first time and kill 4 people. But I would never say that because I've seen someone have no criminal history and start out with the most horrific crime ever. Professor Mike.
Yeah, Billy, it's really strange because, he is a loner. He doesn't seem to have a lot of close friends. But he has a normal, quite regular, common family, 2 sisters, a mom and a dad, a very traditional family. And here he is, someone who outwardly, in some respects, looks like a very successful student. Got his bachelor's degree. He's got his master's degree from DeSale or something like that. And then he goes out to University of Washington. And suddenly, from the time he gets there in August till November 13th, he appears to be an ordinary student. Yeah, he's having some problems. So it is rather strange. But as you're talking, I would like to ask Dr. Debbie Goodman a question. And that is, and this has bothered me because even though we know they got his DNA and I'm 100,000% sure it's him, is it possible that he began having some sort of murder ideation in his head, and within, say, 6 weeks of getting to Washington, a place he'd never been before, and that he had found somebody to be enamored with, infatuated with, and plan a killing? Is that something that have you ever run across that in that really brief time period?
Absolutely, Professor Mike, 100%. I think that he was interested in, fascinated by the field of criminology, obtaining a bachelor's and master's degree, and he wasn't too far in yet to the doctoral study, but I've thought about this too. And I think he made a very intentional and purposeful decision, almost like his own social experiment, because he would have been well versed on who knows how many dozens and possibly hundreds of cases of high profile status of serial killing, mass killing. I think he would have gone on to become a serial killer had he not been caught as a mass murderer. And everything that we've talked about on other high profile cases, or the times we've talked about him, the mens rea, I think, was there, the criminal mindset. And then, he's thinking about it, he's planning it, very intentional, very purposeful. And then, of course, the actus reus, carrying it out. I would also add to, the question that Sergeant Bill asked you, Professor Mike, about who is Bryan Kohberger. I absolutely think he's a sociopath. He has zero remorse. I don't think we'll ever see a tear shed from him. If and when we might, it's all going to be the alligator tears, right? And self-reflection about what will be the rest of his life, potentially behind bars. And I think he's also a hedonistic individual. When we talk about hedonistic murderers, these are people who derive pleasure from beginning, middle, till the end. They think about the crime, they plan it, they carry it out, and they're also intrigued by the aftermath. And all of a sudden, for somebody whose name we never knew, nobody heard of this guy, now the whole world knows his name and he enjoys this.
Dr. W is like, you did compare him and others have compared him to a serial killer. And Matt, I wanted to ask you this question, is that, was this Bryan Kohberger's first time out?
Well, it sure looks like it. With the resources available, especially with how they went into the familial DNA, Looks like it was. Looks like it was. Now, we don't know what he did to lead up to this, but I totally agree with Dr. Goodman. This has all the makings of a serial killer, whether there are sexual components or not. You know, from the prosecution standpoint, when you do these bifurcated death penalty cases, you know, the first phase is the guilt phase. Then you get into the penalty. The jury will be tasked to decide. They will weigh the aggravating circumstances versus the mitigating circumstances. So what the defense is going to do is they're going to have unlimited resources built to answer that question. Who is Bryan Kohberger? They'll get into his school history. They'll talk to whatever friends he had. If he was ever bullied, we're probably going to get information on that. They will dig up every mitigating fact for the jury to consider. In California, they're called the A through K factors. So it's A factor is circumstances of the offense, which include very significantly impact upon the family members. And the jury is told you have to assign an individual weight to all of those things, brutality of the crime, all those sorts of things, and balance it against any factors in mitigation. And if the aggravating factors substantially outweigh the mitigating, well, then they can come back with a death verdict. If they don't, then they're supposed to return a verdict of life. That's the way the legal framework breaks down. So as a prosecutor, remember, motive is not an element to the crime of murder. So it's very interesting to think about, you know, what compelled him to do it. Was he there to rape one of the women, and then the plan went pear-shaped because there's another woman in her bed sleeping? You know, like, who knows? But it's like a lot of the sex cases that I used to prosecute before I got to homicide. We don't really have to get into their heads all that much. If he did it, to a certain extent, I don't care who Bryan Kohberger is or what made him do it or what was going on in his head. And more importantly, as a prosecutor, I don't have to prove any of that. All I have to prove is that he went in there with a knife, and that makes it a first-degree residential burglary regardless of what his intent was. He slaughtered 4 kids, and the grief that those families went through so substantially outweigh whatever they're going to be able to dig up in his background that he deserves a death penalty. I think that's the framework that the prosecution is going to approach it with, and I think that's the right way to go.
You know, just when people look at, again, who is he, and if you look at the old videos on this case when it was just, you know, they didn't catch him yet. And Banfield, is it a cold case? After 6 weeks, it was like we were like pulling our hair out, you know, like, no, it's not a damn cold case after 6 weeks. Bring in the FBI, bring in the CIA, bring in the National Guard. You know, it's like crazy. Like, no, let them work the damn case. It took 6 weeks. That's not unreasonable whatsoever. But there's like overload of too many talking heads that don't know what the hell they're talking about, giving their opinions on this stuff. And the regular consumer, they're all over the place because they're getting all these opinions. And then this one guy from New York, I won't even mention his name, he wrote a book on it, and he's a former writer for the New York Times. He doesn't know shit about homicide investigation, but he's being interviewed on every station as an expert. Like, why are they interviewing this guy? He's a writer, and he's a biased writer, you know? And so it's like, that stuff drove me out of my mind as this case was going on. And now here we are 2 years later. And how much more do we even know about Bryan Kohberger? Professor Mike.
Yeah, Billy, you know, I'm fascinated by that, but who he is, but Matt's right. You know, it doesn't really matter so long as you prove that he was there at that particular time with that particular weapon and he killed them. But it was really frustrating. 6 weeks is nothing. It might take you 6 weeks to get blood work back from a lab on some dead person's, you know, autopsy or cell phone information from Verizon. 6 weeks is nothing. That's warp speed in this case. Thankfully, in this case, the Moscow, Idaho chief, I think Chief Fry, he got lambasted because people said he's way in over his head. He was smart enough to call in the state police, and within 24 hours, the FBI was there helping out every step of the way. He had excellent help. 6 weeks is warp speed. And unfortunately, because you watch Law and Order on TV, everything's done within 60 minutes. And you know, the times they give you, and they always give you the dramatic music, and here we are in the DA's office, here we are in the trial, here we are this, and it just goes boom, 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 and it's done. And that is a huge disservice to, I think, to the public, because they really get a false sense of how criminal investigations are done. And it's a real disservice to the cops in this case. The idea, this is a cold case. When we heard about it, I remember joking about it with you. It was like, what's cold about it? It's 6 weeks. They're right in the middle of it. That's really sad, because that did a huge disservice and really made people, I think, question the police, what they were doing and what answers they would come up with. And unfortunately, also with the fact that there's no leaks whatsoever,